Chapter 23. The Viet Minh Play for Keeps. We had moved into Vietnam only a couple of years after the 8-year war between the Viet Minh and the French, and while the war had been mainly fought in North Vietnam, there were still many thousands of sympathizers in South Vietnam, that part of the country which we elected to assist. Everywhere I went in the jungle were evidences of the Viet Minh. They were broken down into cells, usually a dozen stalwarts, but sometimes less, and these bastards were continually attempting to persuade not only the ethnic Vietnamese to accept their dogma, but they also attempted to influence the Moi as well. Tay Minh, a city not too distant from Saigon, it lay to the west and was almost on the Cambodian border, was a hot spot for the Viet Minh. The town was filled with Buddhist temples, and the streets had more than their share of the yellow-robed priests. The jungle about the place was rife with the commie organizers. We had no troops in Tay Minh, but we had a regiment outside the town towards Cambodia. I visited there with regularity and persuaded the little colonel who commanded the outfit to build a 200-meter target range. He was Ngo Tan Le, and he was intelligent and was really trying to improve his troops. We went out to see the new range, and I complimented him on its construction. On the return to the regimental headquarters, we ran smack dab into a neat ambush where the Sauri road dipped into a very sharp donga. Among the first shots, a bullet struck Colonel Lee behind the right ear. I had only my .45 auto, and as the driver had promptly bailed out and left the Jeep in gear, the first thing I had to do was to stop the car. This I did, rolling out on the driver's side. The bushwhackers seemed to only be intent on killing the CO. They fired only a few shots, most of which missed the Jeep and the interpreter, who sat paralyzed. I let off a clip from the .45 into the rocks where the ambushers had been, not, I must admit, with much lethal intent. I couldn't see a soul. Then the interpreter and I loaded the colonel in the back seat. He had been in front with the driver, and I trundled a little 4x4 and the dead commander back to the barracks. The driver had simply evaporated. I offered to take a squad and go back and beat the bush for the ambush party, but no one showed much enthusiasm for the suggestion. I gathered up my own Jeep. I had no driver all the while I was in Vietnam and drove off toward Saigon. The incident was a lesson to me. I never again left my own vehicle without fetching along my rifle, whether the M1 or one of my hunting rifles. While after this killing I went up country, our last outpost was at Kon Tum, where there was a division of troops. I'd gone up to look in on this outfit, and as the weekend was coming up, I moved off to the west for a couple of days' quest for leopard. I very probably journeyed off westward so far that I was no longer in Vietnam, but was in neighboring Laos. It did not matter. There were no frontier markers, no people, no habitations, only trails. I threaded down an elephant path made by the Moi, and finally pulled up short at the Si Son River. This was a sizable stream, and I was sure I was pretty much on the headwaters. There was a crossing where the pachyderms regularly waded, and a short distance from the ford was a grass shack, of the kind that the Moi build. Because it was the commencement of the rainy season, I gave the shack an inspection. This look-see included taking a stick and running it around the eaves. The Black Cobra, when it rained, did not like to get wet, so they made it a practice to move into the abandoned huts, slither up into the eaves, and make themselves comfortable. This was fine with me, except that occasionally one would tumble off his perch, and you didn't want them to land in your bedroll. The probe about the eaves uncovered no snakes, so I moved in. I parked the Jeep beside the little grass house and went off to cut for sign along the riverbank. Both tigers and leopards are big water drinkers, and after a meal the first direction is towards water. I moved along the stream for a mile, maybe more, and noted the country was rife with game. There were 3 herds of gar, numerous bantang, and plenty of sambar and the saucy little muntjac. But of the great cats I could not turn up a single footprint. I had commenced the return swing when I was startled to hear voices from the far side of the river. I should point out that this stream wasn't much more than a big creek, and while miles below it grew into a sizable stream, in my location it was perhaps 40 feet in width, with thickly forested banks. It was surprising to me that there would be anyone in this remote part of the jungle. It was, I concluded, a band of Moi, and probably with their elephants. I crouched down and stared intently into the bush. The party was going upriver, like myself, and I suspected would see the Seesan where I had stopped my jeep. I watched for them, and directly I saw the group. It was not the Moi, I instantly concluded. There were 5 in the party, and every man Jack had an AK-47 slung over his shoulder. These were Viet Minh, I surmised, although I also cautioned myself that I just might be in Laos, and this could very well be a Laotian border patrol. I got the hell out of there, let me tell you. I legged it for my jeep, and just as I got inside of the vehicle, perhaps a distance of 35 yards, the jungle is terrifyingly dense. The Viet Minh was just fording the stream. I shot the leader at a distance of not more than 40 yards. I had a Savage Model 99 in .358 Winchester caliber, and while it wasn't designed for war, it was a fast repeater. Just as quick as I could work the lever, I ground another round in the chamber and shot the second man. The others, by this time, were screaming like maniacs. The 3 turned and scrambled for the far bank. I could have shot 2 more, but I did not. None of the party had their rifles in their hands. These were slung across their backs. One fellow, I remembered, carried his swung across his front, but he made no move to lift it. Needless to say, I climbed into my jeep and drove back to Con Tum. I had scarcely gotten a quarter mile down the back trail before I breathed easier. I concluded this was a Viet Minh cell going probably to some village near Con Tum, where they could incite unrest and indoctrinate the natives. I hunted up the advisors of ours with the division, and I told the light colonel who was in charge what had happened. He thought we'd better discuss the affair with the colonel commanding the division, so we went over to see him. He smiled, shook his head, and through the interpreter said, No problem, you in Laos. When I got back to Saigon, I went in to see the chief of staff, who was a fine Joe, a full eagle named Singletary, and I told him about the killing. You sure you were in Laos? He wanted to know. All I could say was that the division commander thought it was over the frontier. I'll tell the old man, he informed me. I went around in fear and trembling for the next 3 days, awaiting the summons. It never came. Whether the chief of staff simply never told Hangin' Sam, or whether the old man just didn't give a damn, I could only surmise. I stayed out of General Williams' way, and let me tell you, and the fact that he did not have me on the carpet was something I did not question. The rains came, and the Vietnamese military virtually closed down for the duration of the monsoon. It goes on for 6 months, and up in the high central highlands, they say it rains 300 inches. I don't know, I never measured it, but for goddamn sure it rained a lot. I went right on making my regular rounds to the 10 divisions, and I also hunted through the torrential downpours. I knew I'd never be back, and there was the best hunting in the world next, perhaps, to Africa. I couldn't stack arms for 5 months. Hell, I was only there for a year. I simply could not miss out on a half a year of good shooting because of a little moisture. I found that it required 3 changes of uniform, 2 sets of fatigues would be drying while you wore the third. The same was true of foot gear. You'd have to have 2 pairs of boots inside while you wore the third pair. This was in 56 and 57, and the Army hadn't developed the jungle boot, which came into being during the war. This jungle foot gear has a rubber bottom and a canvas top. I had to wear paratrooper boots, all leather and hard to dry out once the leather was thoroughly soaked. Firearms suffered, but not as much as you might think. I was generous with the oil and made a scope, and while the scope occasionally filled up with moisture, most of my battery had only iron sights, and so was small problem. I had fetched along 13 guns and 2,600 cartridges, and I kept the ammunition pretty carefully stored so that it always functioned very satisfactorily. During the first month of the monsoon, I was 75 miles northeast of Saigon on the Song Lang River near the village of Vo Dat. I had been at Dejring, but returning over Highway Number 1, I had turned aside to shoot an Asian water buffalo. There were some considerable marshes on either side of the Song Lang, and here the tools grew 10 feet in height. The buff liked to lay up in this cover, and I went to pry out a surly old bull bovine. Now that I look back on this little expedition, I'm slightly ashamed that I ever made it. Just what in the hell I reckoned I'd have done with a 2,000-pound buffalo had I shot it. To butcher the meat would have required a half-dozen moi, and the mountain people lived nowhere near vote that. Had I had the good fortune to have collected a trophy head, a bull with horns ranging out to 10 feet from tip to tip, there wasn't any way in the world I could have walked out with the trophy. Be all that as it may, I never fired a shot. I thrashed around in the 10-foot reeds all afternoon. The only way you could make progress was to get in a sort of tunnel made by the buffalo and follow it out. Sometimes it arched over the spoor until you could scarcely see the sky. Other times the herds of game had habitually used the area and had trampled about until you had a small opening in which to look about. I remained hunting until it was the deep dusk of the coming night. I then fought my way out of the marsh and felt pretty lucky to find the Land Rover. I was still a long way from Saigon, and about 20 miles of this route was over little more than a jungle trail. I switched on the headlights and buzzed through Vodat, a collection of huts up on stilts to avoid the monsoon, and was bowling down the road to make junction with Highway Number 1, the thoroughfare to Saigon. I'd just swung around a sharp turn and leveled off on a straight stretch of the trail when just above the beam of the headlights I saw a line of some kind stretched across the trail. I knew instantly what it was. We'd had quite a bit of this skullduggery by the Arabs in North Africa during the campaign there. The natives would cut down a length of telephone line and taut it across a road. All vehicle in Tunisia during the fighting traveled at night without lights and with the windshield laid forward. Of course, there was no tops. These had long been discarded. The name of the game was to decapitate the driver. The telephone line would be stretched at just the proper height to miss the radiator and slip over the steering wheel, catching the driver just at chin level. We shortly resolved that little hazard by simply welding a length of angle iron to the bumper. This stood up in front of the Jeep and neatly severed the stretched wire before it could harm the driver or his passenger. When I saw the line stretched across my return route, I braked to a halt. I wasn't going more than 15 miles an hour because of the condition of the trail, which was filled with monsoon waters and rutted from my inward passage. What made the trap even more ridiculous was the fact that I had a Land Rover with a fully enclosed body. Had I struck the line, it would have been severed by the body of the truck. I suspected an ambush, and when I hit the ground I had the Savage 358 in my hand. I banged up a shot into the jungle at the left of the line and promptly swung over and loosened another into the cover at the right end. There was no response. I walked forward, fully in the lights of my vehicle, and examined the decapitation wire. It was no wire at all, but a jungle vine. A tough one about a half-inch in diameter. I stopped to wonder just who in hell had brought the word from North Africa to South Vietnam that this was the way to behead unwary American soldierly. I walked to either end of the line, rather hoping I'd find a Viet Minh at one end or the other. There was no one. I got out a machete I always carried and hacked the great tendril in two. The Vietnamese had a single battalion of paratroopers. It was commanded by a light colonel named Hoy. He was a bit puffed up on himself and had designed the parachute badge which the Army had adopted. It has to be the most fancy and ornate jump badge ever designed, big enough for 3 of our badges, with a huge pair of wings. These latter set against a background of rising suns, stars, and elephants. It had to be seen to be believed. We had 2 of our majors who were the airborne advisors, and they had qualified all the 450 men in the skinny little battalion. The little people don't like to leap out of airplanes, a senior advisor confided to me. That's most of the reason the battalion is not fleshed out. I asked him to tell me a week in advance when they would be jumping, and I'd like to make a jump with 2 of them. He assured me he would leave word. Time went on, and I had no word, so I called him. He was a little evasive, and I got the impression he wasn't too keen about jumping with his charges. At any rate, after some persistence on my part, I finally went out to the airfield, and a single, lonely, beaten-up old C-47 was standing there, its engines barely turning over. I was issued an old T-8 assembly, and I adjusted the straps and hoped fervently some little Vietnamese had packed it properly. We loaded up, and I was slightly startled to find that neither of our advisors were on hand. The senior, a jazzbo named Turney, had assured me he would lead the jump stick. It did not matter to me. When we came in over the DZ, I was the man standing in the door, and out I went. When I got on the ground, I found I was the only man to jump. I gathered up the old chute and walked over to the old 6x6, waiting to haul the jumpers back to base. The old C-47 made another pass over the DZ, and this time was 500 feet higher than on my jump. We usually go out around 1,000 to 1,100 feet in training. I reckoned we'd been at about 850 feet when I was pushed off. Now at about 1,500 feet, three jumpers quit the ship. There were 26 paratroopers in the 2 sticks aboard the plane. I couldn't understand what the strategy might be. Finally, the plane made another pass, this time at fully 1,800 feet, and the remainder of the 2 sticks ejected. They were scattered from hell to breakfast. I was watching, and I could see the reason for this. The little people must have counted to 5 very slowly after each jumper hit the end of the static line. They had evidently had collisions in the air, a pretty common happening, and to avoid this intended to give each other lots of airspace. This is okay for play, but it is verboten in combat. You want all your people on the ground just as closely bunched as you can get them. When we jump, every man is belly to butt to the next fellow. When we get out piled literally on top of each other. Occasionally you land on some other trooper's chute, and collisions are common. But unless you do this, you simply get on the ground so badly scattered you will be shot to doll rags before you can assemble your force. One jump with these little people was enough for me. I wasn't on jump status, and if you make any leaps and get a busted leg, the Department of the Army takes an exceedingly dim view of the exercise. I knew, too, if Hangin' Sam heard about me making parachute leaps, he'd probably have me on the carpet. My adventures up until then had gotten by his somewhat critical eye, and I didn't want to press my luck. It was pretty obvious to me that not only were the Vietnamese paratroopers scared of their mission, but they were getting small encouragement from their American advisors. I washed my hands of the business. The marksmanship training program was going about as well as the other activities. All the divisions built 300-meter rifle ranges. There was a desultory effort to establish artillery firing ranges, and some of the divisions had designated spots for machine gun firing. 2, the Nung had a pistol range, a mortar range, a grenade court, and a bayonet course. Because they were as big as Americans, the average Nung must have stood 5'10", they could handle the .45 auto, and they showed a lot of interest in the bayonet. The run-of-the-mill Vietnamese couldn't carry the bayonet. He wanted no part of it, but the big Chinese were different. I watched them run the bayonet course, and it was pretty obvious they liked the idea of jabbing the enemy with the knife. It appealed to me that we ought to hold the first Vietnamese National Rifle and Pistol Championships. I broached this to Carter Townsend, who was the G3, and he thought it was a good idea. I proceeded to lay on a 3-day shoot, which would be staged in a local rifle range, which was between Saigon and Ghi Dinh, the biggest shooting gallery in the country and capable of handling the entry. I wrote the course of fire and dictated the teams and individuals who could enter. Each division was permitted 2 5-man rifle teams and 1 5-man pistol team. There was a bar match at 300 meters, and each division could enter both individual and a single 5-man team. Each day, the 20 teams shot over the courses, which commenced at 100 meters, ran back to 200 meters, and concluded at 300 meters. The pistol teams were limited to 15 and 25 meters, slow, timed, and rapid fire. They shot every day as well. As far as I was concerned, the first Vietnamese matches were a great success. The only fly in the ointment was that the Nung Division won everything. They not only took all the team matches, rifle, BAR, bar, and the pistol, but their individuals annexed all the prizes for better shooting. This was utterly no surprise to me. I could see these soldiers applied themselves with a more intelligent and aggressive attitude, and to evidence this in the shoulder-to-shoulder match firing was to be expected. General Williams came out and presented all the medals. There was not a soul on hand from the Vietnamese Army headquarters. I drove up to Dalat a good deal. It was about 160 miles, and the road was good. The town was pleasant. There were 4 of our advisors in the place, and Ngo Van Chi was always on hand and cheerfully willing to organize a hunt, even though it might only be for the weekend. Between Saigon and Dalat was the sizable town of Jiring. This place had been the headquarters of a noted French big game hunter. He had either cleared out or been killed by the time I arrived, but I never passed around the little city without thinking about him and wishing he was still on hand. Beyond Dajring and toward Dalat was the Daquin River, and a trifling little range of hills through which the highway meandered. The road crossed the stream at Locowil, a trifling collection of huts, and just beyond were some rock bluffs. The last 2 times I had gone to Dalat, shots had been fired at me from these bluffs. None struck very close, but I could see the burst. It was undoubtedly from the French Moss 49 rifle, which is a 7.5 millimeter. The French had left quantities of these rifles, and undoubtedly considerable numbers had fallen into the hands of the Viet Minh. It is a formidable weapon, and in the hands of a good shot is not to be trifled with. This time, while remembering the past 2 bushwhack incidents, I carefully hid the Land Rover a full mile from the rocky abutment, and proceeded on foot. I had this time the M1 rifle, a bandolier of clips, and besides the rifle I'd fetched along a brand new Smith & Wesson 44 Magnum revolver. It was brand new in those days. The year was 57. The revolver had only been sprung on an unsuspecting shooting public the year before, and I'd gotten one of the first. At any rate, I proceeded with a great deal of caution. I had no way of knowing whether the ambushers worked the bluffs every day or whether they had their fun and games only on alternate Tuesdays. Two, I wondered whether there were only 2 or 3 of the little bastards, or perhaps might be a whole squad. I determined to find out. I made my approach along the Daquin River, which was as bushy as only a jungle river can be. It took a long time, and I did not hurry. I finally found a trail working upwards towards to the very top of the bluffs. It showed some recent travel, and I decided this was probably the very pathway these Viet Minh used to command a view of the highway below. I was somewhat in a quandary whether to follow along behind the snipers or simply to wait beside the trail until someone either came along, going up to the lookout, or coming down. I was mulling this over in my mind when a pebble rolled on the trail just above. I was in the very middle of the pathway when I heard the noise. I hastily slipped out of the way, taking refuge behind nothing more than a thin screen of brush. What if there's a whole squad? I speculated. I'll have to shoot like hell, I told myself. I waited. Down the trail came a single Viet Minh. He had the Moss 49 over his shoulder and a bag of rice in his left hand. When he got even with me, he chanced to look around, and there in the mud of the path were my big paratroop boot prints. I was watching him, not more than 3 to 4 steps from the little bastard. I saw the wild look come in his eye, and he glanced around fearfully, meanwhile swinging the French 7.5 millimeter off his shoulder. Instead of shooting this Viet Minh with the service rifle, I shifted the rifle to my right hand and pulled out the big 44 Magnum. I let this ambusher have the first 240 grain slug right through the ribs on the left side. It was probably the first man ever killed with the 44, because it was quite new in those days. The effect of the bullet on this pint-sized Oriental was indeed impressive. It literally swept him off his feet. It lifted him off the ground like he'd been struck by a huge club and dumped him some 4 or 5 feet away. I'd shot him double action. Now I deliberately cocked the big revolver and put another bullet in him, this one aimed at his throat. I glanced up in the old Moss 49 rifle, and I gathered up the old Moss 49 rifle, and without bothering to see if there were any of his fellows in the high seat of the bluffs, I turned and meandered back down to the highway. I never bothered to tell the chief of staff about this little incident, and indeed did not relate it to anyone. I made numerous journeys to Dalat after that, but that was the last sniping incident along the Daquin River. I gave the Moss 49 to Kim Saw, who was delighted with it. What he ever did for cartridges I never knew. Suffice to say that a month later, she and myself were at an extended shikar east of Ban Mae Thot, and Kimmy killed an elephant with the rifle. I never counted the shots, but I heard them, and I'd reckoned he shot this tusker not less than 10 times. We were near a Moy village, and the inhabitants swarmed over that 4 tons of rich red meat and butchered it to the last scrap and piece. Kim Saw was the hero of the occasion, believe me. The normal tour in Vietnam was 12 months. My tour was winding down, and I made preparations to return stateside. Dorothy had shipped Bill off to New Mexico Military Institute, a mighty fortuitous decision, and I was pleased about it. The discipline was tough indeed, not that Bill was in need of any exceptionally stringent handling, but among other things he was taught to study and he was supervised day and night. Even the evenings in study hall were under the eagle eye of a teacher. It was a most exemplary school, and I was pleased about it. Jill, her mother, sent to another very outstanding private school, an institution in El Paso, and like her brother, the training and the fine association, both with the instructors and the other kids, was exceedingly high level. My little bride, a most extraordinary wife and mother, had relieved my mind of the care ordinarily shared with the men of the house. Over a long military career, Dorothy had exhibited literally times without number her loyalty, good judgment, and complete dedication to her family. I was grateful, believe me. The old man wants to see you, Carter Townsend informed me when I turned up for duty on the Monday after the little adventure on the Delot Highway. Oh, Christ, I thought. Now what has the old bastard gotten on me? I sallied over to the Sanctum Sanctorium, was announced by the General Secretary, and was issued into the lordly presence. I saluted smartly, reported my name, and stood at attention. Sit down, Sam ordered. He was smiling, wintry little smile he usually reserved for people who were about to get the shaft. You've been here now 11 months. Are you ready to go home? I informed him I was ready. I'm going to keep you for a while, he informed me. You are too valuable to us, and I think it would be better if you hung on for at least another 2 or 3 months. You have done a most outstanding job on this marksmanship training program, and I am quite happy with your progress, he said. Coming from Hangin' Sam, this was high praise indeed. Of course, I had to tell him I'd be glad to stay for an extended tour. You didn't tell General Williams that you didn't like anything. You took it and you kept your mouth shut. I was held over for 2 months. I kept right on with my usual program. I swung past all the divisions, hunted over the weekends, made an agreement with Pope that come next January, which would be 1958, we'd meet in Nairobi, Kenya, and make a 35-day safari. Finally saw my replacement arrive, a fellow who had utterly no background in firearms whatever, and I hied away to Hong Kong en route to home. Little did I dream when I took Air Ngoc Boam, as we referred to the Vietnamese National Airlines, that Bill Askins would be back in the mosquito-infested peninsula within 8 years, there fighting a war which went on for 8 years. Bill was then a lieutenant with the Marines and was a chopper jockey. He lost 3 aircraft during his 12-month tour. Later on, during the latter sieges of the ill-fated war, he was again in Indochina, this time as a member of the CIA. When it all folded up, he was 100 miles south of Saigon in the Mekong Delta country. He went over to a nearby airfield, commandeered an old battered aircraft, and flew it to Thailand, accompanied by a handful of faithful Hmong mercenaries, thus escaping the vengeful North Vietnamese who overran the airfield as he departed. Before quitting the country, Sonny went over to the nearby port on the Gulf of Siam, Ratchgia, and there he bought a seagoing craft and leased another of the same draft. On these 2 ships he placed all his most trusted people, their families, and such of their possessions as they could handily fetch along. One of the boats made it through to safe haven in Thailand, but the other was captured by the Viet Cong. Before I departed the mission, the boys gave me a farewell dinner at the fanciest French restaurant in town. During the course of the festivities, when everybody got pretty drunk and some were maudlin, Carter Townsend, my immediate boss, Carter went on to make Major General, read a bit of doggerel which particularly touched me. I was amused by the verse and slightly startled that I hadn't pulled the wool over the boys' eyes quite as much as I thought. This masterpiece of literal goodness goes like this. We have gathered here together a group of Vietnam's best to eat the farewell dinner with one who has passed the test. This is Charlie Askins, of literary fame, who came to build the ranges and win a tiger hunter's fame. Charlie's traveled every VN road, more times than he can count, from east to west and north to south, in his trusty Land Rover mount. His ready rifle at his side, its purpose very clear, to influence the Viet Minh and shoot the unwary deer. From Sa Dec to Quang Tri, with a stop at Ban Me Thought, Charlie checked all the ranges where there was game to shoot. Elephants, bentag, peacock, wild gar were his joy. Now he is looking for a taxidermist who will stuff his female moy. His outlook on life was sunny, whether rainy day or dry, but they say those yellow glasses gave him a jaundiced eye.